What's up, guys? We're back with another batch of the self-funded sketchbook. We had some great feedback from the first series. I think we did 6 videos in total. We've got another 5 for you where we're going to introduce certain concepts of self-funding in stop loss so that you have a more informed opinion and understand the marketplace. And the very first video we're going to do is one of my favorite subjects in all of stop loss. It's something called leveraged trend. You will need to know what leverage trend is if you ever touch stop loss, and especially renewals. So let's dig in. All right, let's start by defining what is leverage trend. I like to think of it as the compounding effect on claims that a stop loss carrier is exposed to because of underlying medical trend. So that's kind of a mouthful, but that's a basic concept. It is the doubling or compound effect when stop loss carriers start to evaluate the cost of care over time. So let's look at what we in the industry are presuming is going to be the average cost of care increase or medical trend in the overall healthcare landscape in 2025. The most common number that I've seen cited is 9%. Some argue it could be closer to 11. I'm going to be conservative for the calculations, and we're going to assume the cost of something today versus the cost of something next year, 9% more expensive than it was before. The other component of leverage trend you need to understand is it assumes the stop loss deductible remains constant year after year after year, the specific deductible that we defined in previous videos. So let's look at the math of how this compounding effect of leverage trend works. And so we're going to look at a stop loss deductible or a spec deductible of $50,000 in year one. We're going to have a claim of $100,000. So a claim that goes over the spec, and there will be a reimbursement of course, 100 minus 50. The stop loss carrier reimburses $50,000. Of course, we're not looking at leverage trend in year one because we're using that as a baseline. Okay, so what happens if we keep our spec at $50,000 the next year? The claim is going to be a 9% increase, so that $100,000 claim is now $109,000 instead. Because we kept our spec the same, that stop loss carrier is now reimbursing $59,000 for the same claim in the following year. And so that $59,000 is not a 9% increase. Let me pull up my calculator and show you. I know the amount already. You guys can probably do the math, but let me show you what the actual increase is. So if we look at $59,000, which is what the stop loss carrier reimbursed in year 2 for the same claim, and we divide that by what they reimbursed in the first year, which was that $50,000, that's actually an 18% increase. So when I mentioned earlier a doubling effect, that same claim for the carrier in the following year, because of 9% underlying medical trend or cost of care trend, they kept their deductible the same. That's actually 18% more expensive for the stop loss carrier. So good rule of thumb is it actually is a doubling effect. It's not always exactly double, but this is what happens when your cost of care goes up and you keep your deductible the same. Leverage trend is a compounding negative experience in what the stop loss carrier is going to reimburse in that following year. All right, let's look at what happens if we continue that forward one more year. So what if we kept the spec the same at $50,000? We had a 9% increase to the exact same claim, so it's now $118,810. That means the stop loss carrier is now reimbursing $68,810 for the exact same claim. So that's not, again, that's not a 9% increase. If you look at $68,810 divided by the $59,000 from the previous year, that's a 16.6 or 16.7% trend or leverage trend for that carrier in the second year. And so, like I said, the math isn't exactly a doubling effect each year, but you look at a 9% trend is having a multiple of effect on the stop loss carrier of what they reimburse. The really interesting thing is what you look at what happens in the total leverage trend over that 2-year period. So if I took that $68,810 and I divided it by the original reimbursement of $50,000, that's actually a 37.6% increase in 2 years of what the stop loss carrier is reimbursing for the exact same claim because of underlying medical trend. Now, people will argue till they're blue in the teeth that leverage trend shouldn't apply, it's not real, et cetera, et cetera. This is a real mathematical phenomenon, whether you agree with it or not. Of course, there's all sorts of other variables that come into play with a renewal, but leverage trend is real, and this is absolutely impacting the renewal for a self-funded employer. Now, what can happen is actually it gets worse at the higher spec levels. Why? Well, you have to understand there's an inverse relationship between the spec deductible going up that drives the premium down. And so the higher your spec, the less that stop loss carrier collects in premium. And so when you have really high spec levels, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 spec, all it takes sometimes is one very large claim for the stop loss carrier to lose money on that group. And so you actually see a worsening of leverage trend on larger deductibles because less premium is collected. What can you do about it? Most employers every couple years evaluate raising their specific deductible. And that can be $5,000, $10,000. You could take this $50,000 spec up to $55,000 in year 2, and the drop in premium would offset leverage trend. And so it's up to the employer and their consultant to evaluate when that's appropriate, how often and how much, but you should absolutely be considering raising your spec deductible every couple years. Another thing that we've covered before is you can add an aggregating specific deductible. That will also bring your premium costs down. It'll bring your exposure up, but you can lower premium and offset some of the leverage trend as a result of that as well. So again, whether or not consultants agree, and I'm not here for a debate of if this should influence renewals and how much, the reality is math doesn't lie, leverage trend is real, and this is how you calculate it. So thanks for tuning in, guys.